really, I think the theme that you're going to hear during our time is the role of culture, right? And the importance of organizational readiness and kind of how you navigate that as you look to really manifest what's happening right now and get the best out of your employees and get the best for your organization. And so maybe we can start with a little bit about you. So, Brian's a part of Deloitte. He had a big promotion towards the end of last year, so congratulations, as a senior manager of solutions architecture. Maybe you can start with telling us a little bit about your team and how they support Deloitte's mission as it relates to almost 350,000 employees, 150 countries. Certainly not a simple operation.
Right. In solution architecture, our job is to solve problems, solve challenges, and try to identify those before they happen, right? Try to be proactive. And with 4,000 plus applications and 60,000 VMs and 350,000 employees, that's hard. And it's hard to keep up with that. And we have to find ways to be better, be proactive, and less reactive. I know the engineers I work with don't like fighting fires all the time, and would like to have more tools in place that keep things running and keep things performing at a cost model, right? So as we're migrating our data centers to the cloud, cost became this major issue. Is that a lot of sticker shock? And as our firms are member firms are starting to get those those bills, it's a much different conversation to have versus CapEx versus OpEx. And so we started looking at tools to help automate some of this stuff and some of these decisions that we had to make at a global scale and much faster than humans can do. The staff we would need to do this with manpower, it's just not fathomable. You can't do it at the speed you needed to do it. So, our solution was to bring in, what was the solution there? Yep, Turbonomic. Is to bring in Turbonomic and to start to look at the ways that the AI engine within Turbonomic can help Deloitte and to help us start becoming more efficient with our cloud spend without ever risking performance. I don't know if you ever worked with a big firm before. We're very risk averse. We don't like anything to take anything down. And so we started looking at ways to do that. And Turbonomic definitely has a great engine that does that. That begins to the next question, though, is how? How do we do this?
Because it's not a straightforward thing. And I think, I listen to the, University of Chicago Medicine. It's a near and dear to my heart. I spent about 15 years in healthcare technology. So the premise of do no harm, I think, has followed me in my career as it relates to the time that I'm now spending in automation. And when we think about and see a lot of the data around forecast, right? So it's predicted that, almost 60% of organizations will have some level of, we say AI ops, but really AI ops is the application of AI to IT operations, right? There's a level of automation that is coming. It's inevitable. It's mandatory fun, right, at this point. But it's not as simple as flipping a switch, right? You can introduce the technology, but there is an entire process that needs to exist around that in terms of trust, in terms of culture. And so what are some of the big challenges you've seen as both in the case of Turbo as well as you looked at other technologies?
So the first thing you get is resistance. It's change. It's different. You're putting decision-making into a platform or a tool that you're used to controlling yourself, but you really can't control it at scale. It just doesn't work. And you find your operations teams are they're inundated with tickets, they're inundated with all these things that they're used to doing by themselves. And there's still that fear, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the FUD factor of what happens to my job if we implement this. If I start letting these tools make decisions for me, where does my job go? Well, as we've seen with the cloud journey, it doesn't really ever go away. It just kind of changes. And you have to just have a different way of thinking. And the biggest thing is just constantly having these conversations with different leaders within the firm and trickling it all the way down and getting people to buy into the concepts and learn to trust the concepts. So you have to start small. You're not going to just put this in and then say, okay, I want you to manage 60,000 VMs for me. You could, it's just not going to work.
And do you think that process for you, because this is something I spend a lot of time talking with teams about as we look at supporting them in transformation, where does it start, right? Because I think there's a lot of arguments out there that maybe it's at the dev level, maybe it gets picked up and it gets flywheeled from there. I think there's another principle, which is one that I see successful a lot more commonly, which is that it has to be a C-suite moonshoot, right? It has to be a choice that the organization is willing to make.
Yeah, you really need your C-level buy-in. and it needs to be solid. It needs to filter its way down as well. They need to stay engaged, is what I've seen. That works, and incentivize people. The biggest challenge I found with engineers or people that don't have a budget, they didn't care what the cost of the cloud was. They weren't incentivized to care. Keep the application running is all they've ever been told to do. And now they're being told to manage cost, don't ever break the app, don't do all these extra things that they're required to do now. But again, by themselves, you're not going to be able to do that, even with just one major application. So it has to be top down, has to be communicated, it has to be consistent, and it has to keep, the message has to keep coming. You know, we talk business transformation all the time, but then living business transformation, as we know, is a totally different experience than just saying it.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I think came up in the previous panel that I also think is really kind of valid when we talk about this process internally is the concept of value, right? So you're going to make choices, you're going to implement or get behind certain special projects to drive transformation, but then how do you show your constituents that the choices are good, right? And so the idea of driving value becomes incredibly important. And so maybe you can talk a little bit as well about, because I think your team started very small, right, with Turbonomic. It was a kind of one thing, more, but there's actually been, I think, a pretty material return on investment associated with it that you've been able to use.
We can show, yeah, the tool definitely allows you to show what actions you've taken, what actions you've taken, what savings you've had. There's cumulative savings. There's also missed savings. What are we missing? And what those tools, these are graphs. These are for executives. Pretty pictures that show what we're doing, that show the value that we're adding. Where are we going with that? Value.
Yes,
Lost my train of
ROI.
thought. So ROI, you can really show the ROI quickly as long as you're taking the actions, and then as that, it's kind of a crawl, walk, run methodology. As you learn to trust the tool, then you start to automate the tool, and then you start to really add in the AI ops, which is integrating ServiceNow and all these other tools that kind of create a true workflow from start to finish, and it's an educational process for a lot of the engineers and the folks doing it.
And you touched on a small thing there, and I think it was nuanced, but it's still, I think, incredibly important for the group as you think about introducing IT automation. It's not necessarily about lights on, fully automated day one. I think one of the things that we've seen successful with different clients that we've worked with is that it's okay if initially the first step is that we're going to give you feedback about what we think should be done, and it's still the human, right, that's executing that. But maybe after 100 times, 500 times, 1,000 times, maybe we get to the point where we say, hey, we've been really consistent. If we can be explainable, can you turn it on? And so have you seen something similar like that with other automations you've put in place?
We're starting to turn that corner, especially with Turbo. And we've been running it for probably, with this major application that we're using, for about 6 months, and they're starting to turn the corner of trusting it. It hasn't broken anything, which is good. We've saved a bunch of money, which is great. But ultimately, in a risk-averse environment, it's about performance and availability.
Yep.
And cost, as we know, with a migration to the cloud, cost isn't typically your number one reason you go to the cloud. It's up there. It's not far from the top. But really, your apps need to run, they need to perform, and they also need to be as cost-effective as you can make them. And that's where we're going with Turbo, is we're really starting to get that automation piece, which really takes the engineer out of the picture, so to speak, and to make smaller decisions, and create a workflow that you almost don't notice Turbo's there anymore, is really the goal.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point for the group as you think about this process of change. It's not instantaneous, right? It just isn't, right? And technology, like people, right, isn't perfect. And so this idea of establishing trust, and I think your note about the importance of sponsorship at the C-suite level, but follow through, right? Because it's one thing to stand up on stage at an all hands and say, we're doing this, right? It's an entirely different thing to see that through, right? And navigate the bumps and bruises that come along with large scale change. Now, I know, because we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that you're a fixture and you've done this in, large organizations. If you were to provide, sort of one of your best lessons learned for the group as we look to close around, how do you get from where we are today, which is this idea of, I think we still see a lot of resistance, right, to that change, to a place where people can begin to trust it? What would you say is the key?
Well, you start small. You start small and build trust with the tool, and get people to trust the actions that it takes, so you're not worried that you're breaking anything. Test it on resizing some VMs, test it on rescaling some volumes, and once people start to see it work, the light goes on. But you are re-educating. There's definitely a re-education process, and as we've seen with the cloud over the last 10, 12 years, we've educated ourselves quite often
Indeed.
and over again.
Yes.